Before we start the story, I'd really appreciate your help. This channel is still new, and we need subscribers to keep creating our history videos. Your subscription is very important so we can keep bringing more content here on YouTube for you. Subscribe and help us grow. Now let's get into the video. The morning sun over Lake Michigan shimmered off the polished metal of a Grumman Wildcat as Commander James H. Flatley stood beside the aircraft, calmly surveying a group of young pilots under his instruction. Although the war had pulled him from his family and placed him into the heart of the Pacific Theater, Flatley was not merely a warrior. He was a strategist, a mentor, and a tactician whose contributions would change the course of naval aviation. Born in Green Bay, Wisconsin, Flatley was the product of a generation raised on discipline and duty. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1929 and was soon immersed in the rigorous training of naval aviation. By the time the Japanese launched their devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Flatley was already considered one of the Navy's finest minds in the air. But it wasn't raw flying skill alone that defined him, it was his ability to study enemy behavior, to spot weaknesses in the fog of war, and to translate chaos into order that would set him apart. In those early months of 1942, the United States Navy was reeling. The Japanese were advancing rapidly across the Pacific, and American carrier forces were still learning how to operate under the pressures of modern warfare. Flatley, already an established aviator, was assigned to Air Group 3 aboard the USS Yorktown, CV-5, and it was here that his legend would begin to form. He quickly earned a reputation not just for his aggressive flying, but for his analytical mind. He understood that victory would come not only from courage, but from discipline, coordination, and adaptation. His first major test came during the Battle of the Coral Sea, where he helped command and coordinate strike groups against the advancing Japanese. But it was during the Battle of Midway that his leadership became irrefutable. Although he did not directly lead the squadrons that scored the historic hits on the Japanese carriers, Flatley was instrumental in organizing the defensive combat air patrols that protected the fleet from counterattack. He grasped the critical nature of maintaining air superiority over the fleet and trained his pilots to anticipate enemy moves and counter them with precision. His skills were also called upon as a tactician and after-action analyst. Flatley was not one to simply return from a mission and move on. He was meticulous in his debriefings, reviewing every detail, studying gun camera footage, listening to pilot observations, and cross-referencing enemy tactics. He submitted detailed reports to the Navy that not only highlighted operational flaws but offered real solutions, innovations that would shape how future air battles were fought. One of Flatley's most enduring contributions to naval aviation came in the development of fighter direction tactics. He pushed hard for greater coordination between fighter squadrons and early warning units. He argued that without proper communication and centralized direction, fighter pilots were operating blindly, wasting precious fuel and often missing intercept opportunities. His recommendations were not ignored. The Navy began to adopt more structured fighter direction centers, incorporating radar information with pilot positioning and enemy tracking. This shift, initiated in part by Flatley's insistence, would prove essential in later campaigns like the defense of Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea. Despite his role in shaping broad strategic developments, Flatley never removed himself from the cockpit. He continued to fly combat missions, putting himself at the same risk as the men he commanded. In fact, it was during his time flying the Wildcat in the Solomon Islands that he solidified his name as a fearless leader. Flying against the formidable Japanese Zero, Flatley employed energy tactics, climbing, diving, and using coordinated team maneuvers to neutralize the enemy's superior turn rate. While many American pilots initially attempted to dogfight the nimble Zero on its own terms, Flatley's methods taught them to play to the Wildcat's strengths: durability, dive speed, and teamwork. He was instrumental in the development of the Thatch weave, a tactic pioneered by his comrade John Thatch. Flatley didn't invent it, but he implemented it with unmatched rigor. The maneuver involved two fighters weaving in formation, covering each other's blind spots and frustrating enemy tailing attempts. Flatley's pilots practiced it until it became second nature, and when executed in combat, it saved lives and turned the tide of aerial engagements. He was so impressed by the results that he formally endorsed it in his reports, helping it become a standard maneuver for Navy fighters. At every juncture, Flatley balanced strategic vision with frontline leadership. His pilots respected him not just as a commander, but as someone who shared their dangers. He knew their fears, understood their frustrations, and never treated them like expendable assets. When a pilot failed, Flatley didn't berate them. He dissected what went wrong, provided new guidance, and sent them back up with clearer purpose. His leadership created squadrons that were not just effective, but loyal, confident, and resilient. But Flatley's contributions didn't end in the cockpit. After being rotated out of frontline combat, he was called to Washington to advise the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. There, he applied his combat insights to shape pilot training programs and aircraft design recommendations. He championed better gunnery training, more realistic dogfighting simulations, and new approaches to aircraft survivability. He believed that too many young pilots were being lost to preventable errors, insufficient training, faulty equipment, or poor mission planning. Flatley fought for change with the same intensity he had shown in the air. In many ways, his work behind the scenes was just as vital as his combat record. He helped establish a doctrine of aerial engagement that would prepare the next wave of American aviators for the brutal realities of the Pacific War. He was also an early advocate for post-mission debriefs, understanding that the real lessons were often hidden in the mistakes. His push for standardized debriefing procedures allowed the Navy to build a body of knowledge: what worked, what failed, and how to improve. These insights became doctrine, and that doctrine saved lives. When the war shifted toward the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, Flatley returned to the fleet. Promoted to captain, he was given increasing responsibility in shaping the air strategy of upcoming invasions. His emphasis remained constant: tactical efficiency, pilot survival, and maximizing the strengths of American hardware. He often reviewed intelligence personally, planning attacks not just based on maps but on first-hand reports, weather forecasts, and even ocean currents. He left nothing to chance. On several occasions, Flatley's planning was credited with minimizing casualties during complex carrier strikes. He would time launches precisely, coordinating bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes so that they struck simultaneously, overwhelming enemy defenses. It wasn't just about brute force, it was about execution. His strategies blended aggression with discipline, and in doing so, he shaped the Navy's new identity in the Pacific, a force that could strike hard, retreat safely, and strike again with even more power. Among fellow officers, Flatley became known as Mr. Tactics. Yet he never let the praise get to him. He continued to seek feedback, ask questions, and write detailed letters and reports, many of which are still studied today in military academies. He knew that the war was far from over and that the only way to win was to constantly evolve. Flatley's mind never stopped analyzing, never stopped searching for that one change that could make the next mission more successful than the last. For the men under his command, he became a symbol of what a leader should be, not just a warrior, but a thinker. He led by example, never asking of his pilots what he wasn't willing to do himself. He treated mechanics with the same respect as officers. He walked the flight deck at night to check on his crews. He answered every question, and if he didn't have an answer, he found one. As the Pacific War continued to intensify, Flatley's influence expanded beyond his own carrier group. Other units adopted his procedures. His combat reports were circulated to new squadrons. His name appeared in training manuals. He had become a blueprint for success, the rare kind of leader whose methods worked because they were born from both theory and fire. In those years, the stakes were unimaginable. The lives of hundreds of pilots, the safety of carrier crews, the outcomes of major campaigns, all could hinge on a single decision made in a briefing room or a radio call during a dogfight. Flatley never took those moments lightly. He prepared relentlessly. He believed that every mission could be won in the planning phase, if the leader was smart enough, humble enough, and bold enough to make the right call. And so, from the earliest battles of 1942 to the turning tides of 1944, James Flatley proved that one man's intellect, when coupled with courage and empathy, could help steer an entire war effort. He wasn't the flashiest pilot. He didn't seek glory. But through his steady hand, razor-sharp mind, and unshakable integrity, he became one of the Pacific's quiet legends. The year 1944 marked a turning point in the Pacific War, and James Flatley stood once again at the center of it. Now a senior officer with growing influence over carrier air operations, Flatley was no longer flying every mission, but his fingerprints were on nearly every aspect of American naval air strategy. His experience from Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons had molded him into one of the most respected authorities in the Navy. More than that, his insistence on detailed planning, pilot preparation, and integrated airgroup tactics was transforming how the U.S. Navy waged war in the skies. One of his most important roles during this phase of the war came in the operational preparations for the massive push into the Marianas, a group of islands that included Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were key stepping stones toward the Japanese homeland, and the battles to take them would involve enormous carrier task forces, amphibious assaults, and the full range of American air power. Flatley was assigned to coordinate airgroup tactics for several carrier units involved in the invasion, and it was here that his ability to fuse intelligence, logistics, and raw combat experience became essential. He reviewed aerial reconnaissance data, studied Japanese defensive positions, and met with pilots who had survived earlier raids to understand what to expect. But more than anything, Flatley focused on timing. He believed that success in airstrikes depended on the rhythm of attack. Bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters had to work in perfect synchronization. Flatley insisted on meticulous launch schedules that would ensure all squadrons arrived over the target simultaneously. He also emphasized altitude discipline, making sure that different aircraft types attacked from appropriate levels to avoid collisions or overlapping bomb drops. His planning paid off. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carrier pilots decimated wave after wave of Japanese aircraft. While Flatley wasn't in the air during those engagements, his tactical guidelines shaped the entire approach. He had helped mold the pilots who flew that day, mentored the squadron leaders, and shaped the combat readiness that allowed the U.S. Navy to deliver such a crushing blow to Japanese air power. Flatley also advocated for the use of combat air patrols in layered defense formations. Rather than relying on a single ring of fighters to defend the fleet, he proposed staggered patrol zones, with overlapping coverage and constant radio coordination. This system allowed carriers to maintain a dynamic and adaptive shield against incoming attacks. It required pilots to fly long hours and respond quickly to orders, but it kept the fleet alive during the most intense waves of kamikaze and torpedo bomber assaults. In meetings with fleet commanders and high-ranking officers, Flatley was known for his calm but firm tone. He wasn't one to boast or raise his voice. He spoke clearly, relied on data, and always backed his points with real-world examples. Whether speaking to a young pilot or a vice admiral, he treated each person with respect. His influence reached beyond tactics. He had become a trusted voice in the strategic direction of the war. By late 1944, Flatley was deeply involved in preparations for the invasion of the Philippines, particularly the landings at Leyte and later Luzon. The Japanese were expected to fight with desperation, and Flatley knew the air battle would be brutal. He pushed for aggressive pre-invasion strikes to soften enemy airfields and limit their ability to launch attacks on American transports and landing forces. His recommendations included round-the-clock fighter sweeps and dive bomber raids on radar installations, command bunkers, and supply depots. These tactics paid dividends when American forces stormed the beaches. Though Japanese resistance was fierce, the success of the aerial campaign made it possible for U.S. ground forces to establish footholds more quickly and with fewer casualties than expected. Once again, Flatley's ability to anticipate enemy moves and counter them through precise air operations had saved lives and accelerated victory. But even amid this success, Flatley never lost sight of the human cost of war. He wrote often to the families of fallen aviators, especially those under his former command. He visited hospitals to speak with wounded pilots and insisted that every squadron under his influence honor their missing and killed with dignity. His compassion earned him a kind of reverence among younger officers. To them, Flatley wasn't just a war hero, he was the kind of leader they aspired to become. He also continued pushing the boundaries of what naval aviation could achieve. As newer aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and SB-2C Helldiver entered service, Flatley reviewed their performance reports meticulously. He pressed manufacturers for reliability improvements and encouraged test pilots to simulate real combat stress in their evaluations. He believed that the war would be won not just in the skies, but in the hangars and factories where those aircraft were being built. One of Flatley's lesser-known contributions during this period was his work in refining the naval pilot training syllabus. Drawing from his own combat missions, he introduced new gunnery drills, formation flying techniques, and emergency procedures into the training routine. He emphasized not only skill but mindset. He taught pilots to remain calm under pressure, to think beyond their instruments, and to communicate with their wingmen even in the heat of battle. These training doctrines would shape an entire generation of naval aviators. As 1945 approached and the war in the Pacific moved toward its bloody climax in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Flatley turned his attention to the increasing threat of kamikaze attacks. These suicide missions posed a new kind of challenge. No tactic, however refined, could fully counter an enemy who had no intention of surviving. Flatley studied these attacks with a grim seriousness, working with radar specialists, damage control experts, and ship commanders to devise better early warning systems and faster response protocols. His team helped develop a more integrated alert system that combined radar, optical spotting, and radio coordination between destroyers and carriers. He advocated for picket ships to be stationed in a wide perimeter around the main fleet, sacrificial positions that could absorb or deflect kamikaze waves before they reached the heart of the task force. It was a controversial idea, as it exposed the picket ships to grave danger, but Flatley believed it was a necessary evil to save the carriers and the thousands of men aboard them. His writings during this period reflect a man grappling with the scale of destruction, yet still committed to the mission. He never flinched from the hard decisions. He knew that tactics alone could not prevent every loss, but he never stopped refining them. His briefings grew more intense, his flight schedules more precise, his critiques more direct. He was preparing the Navy for a final campaign that would test its limits. Behind his dedication, however, was also a growing personal exhaustion. The years of combat, planning, and command had taken their toll. Flatley missed his family deeply. His letters home were filled with hope for peace and a return to normalcy. He often wrote about the future of aviation, imagining a navy that would continue to fly not in war, but in exploration and diplomacy. When the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally brought Japan to its knees, Flatley was among those who watched the celebrations with solemn eyes. Victory had come, but at a staggering cost. Thousands of American aviators had died. Tens of thousands more carried scars, both visible and hidden. Flatley knew he had helped win the war, but he also knew the war had left its mark on everyone who fought it. In the immediate aftermath of the Japanese surrender, Flatley helped oversee the orderly demobilization of carrier groups and the return of squadrons to the United States. He made it a point to speak with as many pilots as he could before they went home. He shook their hands, thanked them, and told them to carry their honor into civilian life. He believed that their generation would be the foundation of America's future, not because of what they destroyed, but because of what they survived and built afterward. Even as the war ended, Flatley's mission continued. He began working with other senior officers to compile post-war assessments of American air operations. These documents would become vital records, used by historians and future military planners. Flatley insisted that these reports tell the truth, not just of victories, but of mistakes. He believed the greatest danger was forgetting what had been learned in war. He also started to push for the modernization of naval aviation in the post-war era. He foresaw the coming of jet aircraft and the need for new carrier designs that could accommodate faster, heavier planes. He argued that naval aviation had proven itself as a strategic arm of power and that it deserved the same investment as land and sea forces. His views were not universally accepted. Many in Washington believed naval air power would fade in peacetime, but Flatley persisted. He knew that air power had become the deciding force in modern conflict, and he refused to let it be sidelined. By the time Flatley finally retired from active duty, he had become one of the most respected voices in American military aviation. His legacy extended far beyond the battles he had fought. His tactics had been copied, refined, and taught in classrooms from Pensacola to Pearl Harbor. His values had shaped generations of aviators, values of courage, preparation, humility, and relentless improvement. He never sought public glory. There were no book tours, no political campaigns, no self-promoting interviews. Instead, he spent his post-military years supporting veterans, contributing to aviation safety initiatives, and advising on defense policy when asked. His impact endured quietly but powerfully, in every carrier takeoff, every pilot's checklist, every tactical briefing that bore his fingerprints. James Flatley had transformed the art of naval aviation from improvisation to science, from instinct to doctrine. He had trained men to survive, to fight, and to think. And through all the smoke and fire of war, he had never lost his moral compass. He had fought not for conquest, but for peace. Not for fame, but for duty. When the war had finally ended and thousands of American servicemen returned to their hometowns, James Flatley's responsibilities only evolved. The Navy needed leaders who understood both the brutality of the last war and the demands of the next one. Flatley, with his profound operational experience and strategic foresight, became a key figure in helping the Navy transition into the post-war world, where naval aviation was no longer a question of possibility, it was a proven pillar of American strength. Assigned to various stateside commands, Flatley found himself overseeing pilot training centers and naval air stations. But unlike many administrators who became content with paperwork and protocols, Flatley made a point of walking the hangars, talking to flight instructors, and observing classes. He saw the future in the eyes of these young men, pilots who had never seen a dogfight but would one day carry the same legacy into the Cold War skies. Flatley was determined to make sure they inherited not just skills, but values. He pushed for the creation of permanent post-combat debriefing procedures, frameworks where returning veterans could share insights with trainers and engineers to create a feedback loop between the battlefield and the classroom. Flatley believed that every error in war was an opportunity for prevention in peace. He also worked to formalize squadron tactics into comprehensive handbooks, complete with diagrams, mission planning templates, and pilot coordination guidelines. It was his way of preserving the hard-earned lessons of the Pacific while preparing for what might lie ahead. One of the areas where Flatley made a particularly lasting mark was in pilot safety and operational efficiency. He advocated for better simulator training, improved maintenance protocols, and standardization of flight deck procedures. He argued that the most experienced pilot in the world was still vulnerable if his aircraft hadn't been properly inspected or if communication broke down during launch. His insistence on these procedures wasn't just about discipline, it was about saving lives. His mantra, repeated in training halls across the country, was simple: a pilot's first victory is returning home alive. He continued to be involved in the evolution of naval aircraft as well. With the jet age looming, Flatley supported experimental test flights and reviewed specifications for new designs. He emphasized range, speed, and survivability, but also pilot ergonomics, cockpit layouts that allowed faster decision-making and clearer instrumentation. He believed technology should serve the pilot, not overwhelm him. Engineers began to consult Flatley's reports not just for historical reference, but for practical insight into how future aircraft would operate in the hands of real pilots under combat stress. His next major contribution came as part of a broader strategic rethinking of the Navy's carrier doctrine. The question wasn't whether aircraft carriers were useful, that had been answered over the skies of Midway, Leyte, and Okinawa. The question now was how to adapt them to an age of supersonic jets, atomic weapons, and geopolitical rivalries. Flatley was among the key voices advocating for a carrier-based deterrence posture. He believed that mobility, not just firepower, was the true advantage of naval air power. To that end, he helped develop war games and scenario-based planning that pitted American carrier groups against hypothetical enemy fleets, including emerging threats from the Soviet Union. He ran drills simulating attacks on radar outposts, strikes on missile launch sites, and interceptions of long-range bombers. These exercises, grounded in realism and executed with Cold War urgency, would become standard fare for the next generation of Navy planners. What separated Flatley from many of his contemporaries was that he was never enamored with titles or prestige. He wore his rank lightly, and often reminded junior officers that authority meant accountability, not privilege. He maintained an open-door policy, even as he rose to positions of great responsibility. When young lieutenants came with concerns or ideas, he listened. When maintenance crews flagged a procedural risk, he took it seriously. The legacy of that humility rippled through every command he led. By the late 1940s, Flatley had become something of a quiet legend within the Navy. He received commendations and citations, but he accepted them only in the name of the teams he led. In private correspondence, he often downplayed his personal role, giving credit to the pilots, mechanics, and flight deck officers who made each mission possible. His humility was not performative, it was deeply rooted in his belief that victory came from unity, not ego. As the Navy faced the challenge of integrating African American aviators and adapting to a more inclusive armed force, Flatley was among those who supported equal opportunity in training and leadership roles. He believed that courage, discipline, and character knew no color. When asked about it in later years, he simply replied, "The enemy never cared who was in the cockpit. All that mattered was whether you could fly." During the Korean War, Flatley did not return to the front lines, but he played a vital role in operational planning and pilot preparedness. He applied many of the same principles that had guided him in the Pacific: multi-layered air defense, combined arms coordination, and careful integration of new jet technology into legacy carrier systems. His efforts helped prevent logistical breakdowns during some of the war's most intense air operations. It was around this time that Flatley also became increasingly involved in public engagement on behalf of naval aviation. He spoke at universities, wrote editorials in military journals, and even appeared on radio broadcasts to explain the strategic importance of sea-based air power. Always careful to avoid political commentary, Flatley focused on history, preparedness, and innovation. His speeches were laced with technical insight, personal anecdotes, and a quiet but powerful sense of duty. As the Cold War escalated and tensions flared across the globe, Flatley remained a trusted voice in military aviation circles. He was consulted on the use of nuclear weapons at sea, on carrier vulnerability to submarine attack, and on the potential role of drone technology. Though he was nearing the end of his active career, he kept himself informed, reading intelligence briefings and attending think tank seminars with the same discipline he had once applied to pre-flight checklists. But perhaps his most enduring legacy was personal. Those who had flown under his command never forgot him. Reunions of his squadrons, held decades after the war, were filled with stories of how Flatley had saved lives through planning, mentorship, or even a single piece of advice given before a dangerous mission. Pilots remembered how he paced the flight deck before an operation, checking harnesses and offering steady words. Ground crew recalled his early morning visits to inspect aircraft before sunrise. Everyone remembered his silence during the playing of taps, and the look in his eyes when a fellow aviator was lost. Even outside the military, Flatley became a respected figure in aviation safety circles. He worked with civil aviation authorities to improve flight protocols, encouraged joint exercises between Navy and Air Force units, and mentored aerospace engineers in designing pilot-friendly systems. In every interaction, he returned to the same principles that had guided his life: preparation, accountability, and honor. In retirement, he turned down lucrative consulting offers and instead focused on community service. He volunteered at veterans' hospitals, helped military families adjust to post-service life, and supported educational programs that taught history through first-hand accounts. When asked why he never sought a political career, he would simply say, "I served where I was needed. That was enough." Toward the end of his life, Flatley remained a private but deeply reflective man. He wrote a series of unpublished essays on leadership, aviation, and the moral cost of warfare. These writings, discovered only after his death, revealed a man who never stopped questioning the weight of command. In one passage, he wrote, "The burden of ordering men into battle is not one you forget. You carry it long after the victory is won. But if you carry it with honor, it becomes a lesson, not a wound." When he passed away, tributes came from admirals, historians, and pilots across the world. But perhaps the most meaningful came from a former wingman who simply said, "He taught us how to fight and live. And more than that, he taught us how to lead." James Flatley's name may not be as widely known to the general public as some of his contemporaries, but to those who study naval aviation, he stands as a foundational figure. His life was not defined by medals, but by missions completed, lives protected, and a system of aerial warfare made smarter and more humane through his efforts. He had taken the raw courage of naval aviation's early years and forged it into a science. He had turned trial and error into doctrine. And through his calm leadership, tireless work ethic, and moral clarity, He had helped shape a navy that could meet any storm, not just with strength, but with wisdom. As James Flatley grew older, his influence didn't wane, it simply evolved into something quieter, but no less powerful. Even after retirement, he remained deeply connected to the institutions and people that had shaped his life. He consulted with young officers not because he had to, but because he believed the chain of leadership only worked if the links between generations were forged in trust and shared experience. His name was often invoked during training sessions, in classrooms at the Naval War College, and in lecture halls where military history was taught not as a story of destruction, but as a story of decisions. Flatley never stopped reading, never stopped learning. He kept a modest office where shelves were lined with manuals, declassified reports, and hand-annotated copies of wartime flight plans. He believed that reflection was not a passive act but a duty. When a former pilot asked him how he dealt with the memories of war, Flatley answered plainly, by remembering everything and forgetting nothing. That became his approach to legacy, not rewriting it, not polishing it, but preserving it in its truest form, with all its victories and regrets intact. He took particular pride in watching the rise of naval aviation into the jet age. When aircraft like the F-8 Crusader, A-4 Skyhawk, and later the F-14 Tomcat began to dominate carrier decks, Flatley never viewed them as the end of an era, but as proof that evolution was the essence of survival. He often visited aircraft carriers to observe flight operations and talk with modern pilots. He never offered advice unless asked, and when he did, it was usually with a smile and a quiet word that cut straight to the point. Those who knew him said he had the rare ability to say one sentence that would stay in your head forever. He became something of a bridge figure, connecting the past with the present. Veterans saw him as one of their own. Cadets and junior officers saw him as a symbol of what a career in service could look like at its best. Historians found in him an invaluable source of insight into some of the most important battles of World War II. But through it all, Flatley resisted attempts to mythologize him. He believed heroes belonged in the stories of others, those who gave everything and never came home. When introduced at events, he often asked for the spotlight to be shared with his peers, his men, and even the technicians who kept the planes flying. Perhaps his most personal contribution came in the final years of his life, when he helped establish a scholarship fund for the children of fallen naval aviators. Quietly and without fanfare, he donated time, resources, and guidance to help the fund grow. He believed education was a form of service too, a way for families torn by war to build something lasting and good. His letters to scholarship recipients were always handwritten, often ending with a line about carrying the flag forward, not through war, but through wisdom. When he was invited to speak at the commissioning ceremony of a new aircraft carrier, he declined the podium and instead asked to sit with the flight deck crew. His belief, unchanged from his days in the South Pacific, was that the battle was won not by admirals, but by those who launched, maintained, and flew the aircraft. When a young sailor asked him what had changed most since his days aboard the Yorktown, Flatley replied, "The aircraft are faster. The carriers are bigger. But the courage needed is exactly the same." In private moments, Flatley often reflected on the fragility of life at sea and in the air. He had seen good men die in seconds, missions fall apart due to a single missed radio call, and heroes emerge from the most unlikely places. He sometimes said that the greatest strength a leader could have was not certainty, but clarity, the ability to see what needed to be done even when the path forward was shrouded in smoke. That clarity, he believed, came only through humility. His wife, who had written letters to him during every day of his wartime deployments, remained by his side into old age. They had raised a family together with the same values that guided Flatley's service: discipline, respect, and quiet pride. One of their sons followed in his footsteps, becoming a naval aviator in his own right. Flatley rarely gave advice to his children about their careers, except to say, "Do your best for those who depend on you. That's always enough." When Flatley passed away, he did so without fanfare, just as he had lived. His funeral was modest by military standards, in accordance with his wishes. There were no long speeches, no elaborate ceremonies. But the turnout told its own story. Veterans flew in from across the country. Pilots who had trained under his command stood at attention in full dress. Letters poured in from former crew members, admirals, and even foreign officers who had studied his reports. One message, from a retired pilot who had flown in the Marianas, simply read, "We made it home because of you." A few years later, the Navy would honor his memory more formally by naming an aviation safety center after him. The decision was not driven by tradition but by recognition of his lifelong advocacy for pilot survival and operational integrity. Inside the facility, a quote from Flatley was etched on a metal plaque: "No mission is successful if we lose those we didn't have to." Over time, his legacy extended beyond the military sphere. Academic institutions studying the ethics of warfare cited his post-war essays. Leadership conferences used his case studies in strategy and resilience. Documentaries featured his voice, sometimes through old audio, other times through interviews with those he'd influenced. His name became synonymous with balance, courage and caution, strategy and empathy, strength and humanity. What defined James Flatley in the end was not just that he helped win a war, but that he helped build a framework where others could succeed long after he was gone. He was the rare kind of leader who never made the mission about himself. Every plan he wrote, every tactic he taught, and every pilot he trained was part of something greater than personal ambition. He understood that war was not a proving ground, it was a responsibility. And leadership wasn't a privilege, it was a burden to be carried with honor. His contributions live on not only in archives and memorials but in the habits and instincts of aviators who still prepare for missions with the procedures he championed. Every time a squadron trains in combat formation, every time a pilot debriefs a sortie with humility and precision, every time a carrier coordinates a strike down to the second, there is a trace of Flatley there. Not in name, perhaps, but in spirit. James Flatley never chased fame. But in doing so, he became immortal in the way that truly matters, by shaping the lives, missions, and minds of those who carried the fight forward. His was not the loudest voice in the war, but it was one of the clearest. And when the storms came, over Midway, over the Philippines, over Okinawa, it was his clarity that helped others find their way home.